My girlfriend asked for space to find herself, slept with other guys, then returned in tears, but I shut her down cold. I never thought that the person I loved most would one day ask me to step back, to give her space as if she were some distant star drifting away from my orbit. My name is Jake. I'm 28 years old, and for the past 3 years, I believed I knew exactly who she was. The girl whose laughter was my home, and whose touch was the safety net beneath every fall. We weren't just a couple. We were a tightly woven thread in each other's lives, tangled up in shared memories, late-night talks, and plans that seemed so certain. But beneath that surface of warmth, something had begun to unravel slowly, almost imperceptibly, like a shadow creeping at dusk. Our relationship wasn't perfect. What love story is. We had our fights, moments of silence that stretched longer than they should, and an unspoken tension that neither of us dared to address fully. I could feel it in the way she sometimes pulled away, her phone screen lighting up with messages she quickly hid, the way her smiles didn't quite reach her eyes anymore. I told myself it was just stress from work or maybe a phase, but deep down, there was a gnawing unease that I couldn't shake. I wanted to be patient, understanding, the rock she could lean on. But patience has its limits, especially when the person you trust starts becoming a stranger. There was something complicated about her family background too. Her parents' messy divorce, the constant shifting between two homes, the lingering bitterness that seemed to seep into her every word about them. I tried to be the calm in her storm, the person who could offer stability when her world felt like it was falling apart. Yet, even with all my efforts, I sensed a growing distance, a gap that neither love nor good intentions could bridge. It felt like walking on thin ice, never knowing when it might crack beneath my feet. I remember the night she first spoke those words. I need space to find myself. It was like a punch to the gut, wrapped in a fragile whisper. Space. Find herself. Such simple phrases, but they carried a weight I wasn't prepared for. I nodded, tried to smile, told her I understood, even though inside, my heart was tightening with every syllable. Could she really find herself by stepping away from me? Was I not part of who she was anymore? The questions spun in my mind, but I kept them buried, afraid that showing doubt would push her further away. In the days that followed, I watched as she grew more distant, the silence between us stretching into an unspoken chasm. I told myself to trust her, to believe in the love that had brought us this far. But trust is fragile, and when it's tested by silence and absence, it begins to crack. There were little signs, missed calls, vague explanations, a shadow of guilt flickering in her eyes whenever I asked too many questions. I wanted to believe that this was just a detour, a temporary lapse in our story. But the feeling that something was wrong settled deep in my chest like an unshakable chill. Then came the day she left, not just emotionally but physically, slipping out of my life like a ghost in the night. I was left with nothing but the echo of her footsteps and the cold reminder that sometimes love isn't enough to hold someone close. But even as I grappled with the emptiness, I held on to a fragile hope that she would come back, that this space she needed was just a journey she had to take alone, and that we would find each other again on the other side. What I didn't know then was that this was only the beginning of a storm more painful than anything I had imagined, one that would challenge everything I thought I understood about love, trust, and forgiveness. And when she finally returned, broken and in tears, I was faced with a choice that would change the course of our lives forever. But that part of the story is still ahead. What came next is something you won't see coming. In the quiet moments when I was alone, the weight of her absence pressed down harder than I ever expected. It wasn't just the physical distance. It was the invisible walls that had been growing between us long before she asked for space. Walls made of silence and unspoken frustrations. I found myself replaying countless small scenes, ordinary days suddenly heavy with new meaning. Like the mornings when she'd brush past me to grab her coffee, barely acknowledging my presence, her mind clearly somewhere else. Or the evenings when I'd catch her staring at her phone, a fleeting smile crossing her lips before she quickly locked the screen, a gesture so subtle yet so sharp it left me hollow. Her family's chaos wasn't just background noise anymore. It had become a storm swirling around us, pulling her further away. I remembered how she'd flinch at the mention of her parents, how her voice would lower when she talked about the fights, the bitterness, the endless back-and-forth custody battles. I tried to be patient, telling myself that her past pain made her retreat now, and that love meant weathering those storms together. But patience felt like a fragile thread stretched thinner with every cold glance, every unanswered question. I was learning a new language of avoidance, a language where love was spoken in silences and distance, not words or touch. Sometimes, I caught glimpses of her hesitance, like when she'd make plans with friends and forget to mention them until the last minute, or when she'd brush off my attempts to talk about us with a tired sigh. It was as if she was slipping through my fingers, not with a grand gesture but in the quiet erosion of everyday moments. I tried to convince myself that maybe she needed time to think, that this was part of her healing, that I should be the steady presence she could come back to. But inside, the ache grew sharper, twisting into a knot of confusion and loneliness that I couldn't untangle. I started to notice how the balance of our relationship was tipping. I was the one making the calls, sending messages, planning our weekends. She accepted, sometimes reluctantly, other times with a distracted nod. But rarely did she initiate. I remembered one night vividly, how I sat across from her at our favorite cafe, watching as she scrolled through her phone while I nervously tried to share a story from my day. Her attention wavered, her smile felt forced, and when she finally looked up, it was like she was somewhere else. That night, the silence between us was louder than any argument we'd ever had. Despite it all, I kept telling myself that love was enough. That if I just held on, if I kept showing up, she would come back to me, whole and ready to heal. I rationalized her distance as a phase, something temporary and fixable. I told myself that she wasn't rejecting me, just struggling with her own demons, and that my loyalty, my refusal to give up, was the anchor that could save us. But those quiet nights alone, staring at the ceiling, I felt the cracks forming in my resolve. The exhaustion seeped into my bones. The uncertainty gnawed at my mind. Sleep became restless. I'd wake up wondering if I was enough, if the person I loved still saw me at all. The laughter we once shared felt like a distant memory, replaced by a coldness that neither of us named but both felt. I found myself shrinking, retreating into a version of myself that was quieter, more cautious. Every unanswered message, every missed call, chipped away at the hope I clung to. Yet, I still resisted the idea that this might be the beginning of an end. Instead, I buried the doubt deep, afraid that acknowledging it would mean losing her for good. And then there was the subtle cruelty I couldn't quite pinpoint. A look, a word left unsaid, a warmth withheld. Not malicious, but enough to sting. I remember the way she'd brush off my worries with a distracted, "It's fine," or how she'd deflect when I tried to share my own struggles, as if my pain was less important, less urgent. It was a slow erosion, a soft fading of the connection that once felt unbreakable. I wanted to fight for us, but I didn't know how to fight silence, how to battle absence. Little by little, the person I thought I knew, the girl who'd been my home, was becoming a stranger. And in that realization, a subtle shift began to take root inside me. Where once there was only hope, now there was a quiet, dawning awareness that maybe, just maybe, love wasn't enough to hold her close anymore. It was late on a Thursday, the kind of night where the city feels both too alive and painfully empty. I was sitting on the edge of our bed, the dim glow of my phone screen, the only light in the room. I'd just finished scrolling through our shared photo album, a digital scrapbook of moments that now felt like fragments of a life I no longer recognized. That's when the message popped up, a text from someone I didn't know, sent to her. The words were casual, friendly, but the timing was anything but. Curiosity pulled me in, and before I could stop myself, I opened the message thread. What I found was a series of texts between her and this other guy, flirtatious, intimate, the kind of words that should never have been shared. At first, I told myself maybe it was harmless, a joke taken too far, or something she didn't mean. But as I read on, the messages grew bolder, the tone more personal, crossing lines I thought we'd never approach. There was laughter, plans to meet, even pictures she'd sent, pictures that weren't meant for me. My heart slammed against my ribs like a desperate drum. I stared at the screen, unable to breathe, as the reality settled in. This wasn't just a lapse or a moment of weakness. She had been living a part of her life without me, a life I wasn't invited into, a life where space meant freedom from the promises we'd made. I felt as if I'd been erased, replaced by someone who didn't need me anymore. The room seemed to close in around me, the silence suddenly deafening. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but my voice caught somewhere deep inside, tangled with shock and disbelief. How could she do this? After everything we'd been through, the late nights, the fights, the dreams we'd built, why would she throw it all away so easily? I felt betrayed in a way that cut deeper than any argument ever had, a raw wound that pulsed with every heartbeat. I sat there for what felt like hours, the phone slipping from my fingers as tears blurred my vision. The weight of the truth was unbearable, each revelation a shard, piercing through the fragile hope I'd clung to. I felt hollow, like the person I loved had become a ghost who haunted my memories but no longer shared my reality. The trust I'd given so freely was shattered, replaced by a cold, unrelenting doubt. And yet, amid the storm of pain, a strange clarity began to emerge. This wasn't just about betrayal. It was about her need for something I couldn't provide, a part of herself that had been lost long before the texts. The space she asked for wasn't just a break, it was a signal, a silent confession that maybe she never really belonged to me in the way I thought. The walls I'd felt growing between us weren't just distance. They were barriers built from choices she had made in secret. In that moment, the denial I'd held onto started to crack. I realized I had been holding onto a version of us that existed only in my mind, a story I told myself to keep the pain at bay. The girl who needed space was no longer the same girl who laughed with me, who trusted me, who dreamed beside me. And for the first time, I faced the terrifying truth. Love, no matter how fierce, sometimes isn't enough to keep two people together. I didn't know what would come next. All I knew was that my world had shifted beneath me, and the ground I thought was steady had disappeared. The person I loved had returned, but she was different, and so was I. The fragile hope was gone, replaced by a cold, aching clarity that nothing would ever be the same again. And as I sat alone, the quiet hum of the city outside mocking the emptiness inside, I understood that some breaks don't heal. They only expose the cracks we tried so hard to hide. The morning after that night felt strangely hollow, as if the world had muted itself just for me. I woke up alone in our bed, the sheets tangled around my legs, the space beside me cold and untouched. Normally, I'd reach out instinctively, hoping to find her warmth there, but this time I didn't. Instead, I lay still, tracing the ghost of her absence like a quiet ache beneath my skin. The weight of what I'd discovered was still pressing down on me, but something inside was shifting, a subtle, almost imperceptible pull away from the chaos of pain and confusion. I got up slowly, my movements deliberate, like I was learning how to be myself again after years of sharing a life with someone else. The apartment was too quiet, the silence thick with memories I wasn't ready to face. I found myself standing in front of the mirror, staring at the reflection that looked back. Tired eyes, a jaw set tighter than usual, a face marked by the traces of sleepless nights and unspoken fears. For the first time in a long while, I allowed myself a moment to really see me, separated from the us that had defined everything. And in that reflection, I glimpsed a man who needed space too. Not the kind she'd asked for, but a space to breathe, to heal, to reclaim his own story. Without fully understanding why, I grabbed my coat and stepped outside. The cold air hit me like a splash of reality, sharp, bracing, undeniable. I didn't have a destination in mind, just the need to move, to put distance between myself and the crushing weight of betrayal. The streets were still waking up. The city's usual hum was subdued in the early hours, and I let my feet carry me without thought or purpose. Each step felt like a quiet rebellion against the paralysis that had gripped me for days. A gentle, self-preserving act of reclaiming control. As I walked, memories drifted through my mind like flickering shadows. The laughter we'd shared on lazy Sunday afternoons, the dreams we'd whispered to each other in the dark, the promises that now felt so fragile and distant. But with each recollection, there was also a strange sense of detachment, a softening of the edges where pain had once cut deepest. I realized I was starting to let go, not with anger or bitterness, but with a kind of weary acceptance that maybe some parts of love were meant to be released, not clung to. I found a park bench beneath a towering oak tree, its leaves still shimmering with morning dew. Sitting down, I let the silence wrap around me, the gentle rustling of branches and distant bird calls offering a balm to my restless mind. Here, away from the walls that held our history, I could finally feel a flicker of something new. Not hope, exactly, but a fragile seed of self-preservation. It was okay to protect myself now, to build boundaries where none had existed before, even if those boundaries were invisible and whispered only to my own heart. Tears came quietly, without fanfare or demand, slipping down my cheeks like a gentle rain. They weren't just for the betrayal or the lost love, but for the innocence I'd carried, the trust I'd given so freely, the version of myself I was beginning to shed. It was grief, yes, but also a subtle release, a permission to mourn without losing myself completely. In those tears, I found a strange kind of strength, one that didn't roar or fight but simply was. Strength in stillness, in choosing to step back rather than be swept away. For the first time in weeks, I sent her no message, made no call. I didn't check my phone obsessively or wait for a sign that she'd return with explanations or apologies. Instead, I decided to hold my silence like a shield, not out of spite, but as a way to guard the fragile space I was carving out for myself. It was a quiet refusal to be consumed by what I couldn't control. A gentle reclaiming of my own boundaries in a relationship that had slowly dissolved into distance and secrets. That day, I didn't pack a bag or announce my intentions to anyone. I didn't need to make a scene or declare my pain aloud. My rebellion was quieter than that, a subtle, personal act of withdrawal, a slow folding in on myself to find the edges that had been lost in the chaos. I wasn't abandoning love. I was choosing to love myself enough to step away from the hurt, even if just for a little while. As the afternoon sun warmed my face, I felt a calm settle beneath the storm that had roared in my chest. It wasn't peace, not yet, but a promise. A silent vow to protect the man I was becoming, even if it meant walking alone for a time. Because sometimes, the most profound change starts not with a scream or a fight, but with the quiet courage to say, "Not today. Not like this." And in that moment, sitting beneath the oak tree, I realized I was no longer just reacting to her choices or the pain she'd brought. I was choosing my own path forward, a path marked by distance, yes, but also by a new kind of clarity. The lines had been drawn, not with anger or bitterness, but with a steady hand and an open heart. And though the road ahead was uncertain, I was ready to walk it alone, if that's what it took. Days passed in a strange blur, a limbo where time seemed both endless and too fleeting. I kept to my routine, but inside, something was shifting. The numbness that had settled over me slowly began to lift, replaced by a restless energy that made it impossible to stay still. It was as if the silence I'd wrapped myself in was cracking, and through those cracks, light was seeping in, tentative but unmistakable. Then, unexpectedly, I heard from Mark, my old college roommate, the guy who'd seen me at my best and my worst, who somehow always knew when I needed to be pulled back from the edge. He'd heard through mutual friends what had happened, and his message was simple but sincere. "Jake, let's grab a drink. You don't have to go through this alone." At first, I hesitated. I wasn't sure I was ready to talk, or to expose the rawness of my pain to anyone. But something about that message, its straightforward kindness, felt like a lifeline. So I agreed. We met at a quiet bar, the kind of place with worn leather booths and dim lighting that made confessions easier. Mark didn't pry immediately. He just listened as I stumbled through the story, the betrayal, the heartbreak, the slow unraveling of everything I thought we had. There was no judgment, no quick fixes, just steady, patient listening. And in that space, I began to realize something I hadn't allowed myself to see before. I wasn't defined by what had happened to me. I wasn't just a victim of her choices or the collapse of our relationship. I was still me, flawed, tired, but fundamentally whole. Mark's presence reminded me of the parts of myself I'd lost sight of in the fog of pain. My resilience, my capacity to care, the quiet strength that had carried me through other storms. He said something that stuck with me. "Sometimes, Jake, the hardest thing isn't letting go of someone else. It's finding the courage to hold on to yourself." Those words echoed in my mind long after we parted ways. They weren't a magic cure. but they planted a seed of resolve that had been dormant. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, the city lights flickering through the window, and I started to write. Not messages to her, not excuses or explanations, but a letter to myself, a reminder of who I was and who I wanted to be. It felt strangely empowering, this act of naming my own pain and hopes without waiting for her to validate them. In the days that followed, I made small but deliberate choices that marked a new beginning. I signed up for a weekend hiking trip with some friends I hadn't seen in years, reconnected with my therapist, and even started reading books about healing and personal growth. Each step felt like reclaiming a piece of my life that had been overshadowed by heartbreak. But it wasn't just about distraction or escape. It was about building a foundation beneath my feet, something solid and real that didn't depend on someone else's presence or approval. I began to understand that space wasn't just something she needed, it was something I needed too. Space to breathe, to reflect, to grow. And with that space came clarity. I saw that my love for her, while genuine, had become entangled with my sense of self-worth in unhealthy ways. I had been so focused on holding on to us that I neglected the man I was becoming apart from her. That realization didn't erase the hurt, but it gave it shape, a painful but necessary part of moving forward. For the first time since this all began, I felt a flicker of control returning, not over her or our fractured past, but over my own story. I wasn't just drifting anymore, I was steering, however tentatively, toward something new. I don't know what the future holds, whether she'll come back or if I'll find a way to let her go completely. But in this moment, I'm no longer powerless. I'm no longer waiting for answers or permission to heal. Something inside me is waking up, and whatever comes next, I'm ready to face it head on. There's a quiet space in the night where my thoughts gather, and it's in that stillness that I wrestle with the parts of me I didn't want to face before. The anger I wore like armor is softer now, but beneath it, something more complicated pulses. Doubt, regret, and a fragile yearning tangled with relief. I'm caught between wanting to reach back and pull her close, and knowing that the distance might be the only thing keeping me whole. It's a contradiction that doesn't ease with time. It's a weight I carry in the depths of my chest, where hope and hurt collide. Sometimes, I question myself, not in the way I used to, when insecurity twisted my thoughts into knots, but with a quieter, more painful honesty. Did I see the signs too late? Was I too blind or maybe too willing to believe in a version of us that never truly existed? I replay moments differently now, like the times she'd brush past me, the hidden smiles, the silent phone calls. And I realize those weren't just cracks in our relationship, they were echoes of her struggle, reflections of her searching. But there's also a part of me that wonders if I missed my own cues, if I let my fear of losing her keep me from saying what needed to be said, or from walking away when I should have. The memories I once held like treasures have shifted shape. The laughter that used to feel like a warm blanket now feels fragile, like glass, beautiful but dangerously breakable. I think about the promises whispered in the dark, and how they were meant to tether us, but instead became chains that tied us to a story we couldn't rewrite. I remember the small kindnesses she showed me, the way her hand fit in mine, and how those moments now carry a bittersweet ache, not just for what was, but for what I thought we were. It's a sorrow that's less about blame and more about loss, the loss of a future that slipped quietly through our fingers. There's guilt too, a quiet, gnawing kind. Not because I did something wrong in the obvious sense, but because I wonder if I could have been more patient, more present, more understanding. I question if my love was enough, or if it ever was. And sometimes, I feel ashamed for the relief that flickers beneath the pain. The relief that the chaos is behind me, that I'm not endlessly chasing a shadow that never wanted to be caught. It's a strange feeling, this mix of sorrow and freedom, and I don't always know how to hold it without feeling fractured. At night, when the world quiets down, I find my mind drifting to the question I've tried to avoid. What if this was never about me? What if her need to find herself was a journey I wasn't meant to be part of? It's a thought that stings, not because it diminishes my love, but because it forces me to confront the reality that sometimes, love isn't enough to fill the void someone carries inside. I'm learning that caring deeply for someone doesn't mean you can save them, or that they owe you the version of love you imagined. And that, more than anything, is both heartbreaking and liberating. I'm also discovering how much of my identity was wrapped up in us. The we I thought was unbreakable. Losing that has left me feeling unmoored, like I'm searching for the edges of who I am without her beside me. It's a gradual process, this unwrapping of self. And it's messy. I have moments when I'm overwhelmed by loneliness, when the silence feels deafening, and I long for the comfort of familiarity, even if it's laced with pain. But then, there are moments of clarity, brief flashes where I glimpse a self that isn't defined by heartbreak or loss, a self that's still waiting to be found. I think about how love can be a mirror, reflecting not just the person we cherish, but also the parts of ourselves we don't always want to see. This relationship forced me to confront my own fears, of abandonment, of inadequacy, of being invisible. And while that confrontation was painful, it also opened a door. It showed me where my boundaries lie, where my needs have been neglected, and where I've been complicit in my own suffering by staying silent too long. That's a kind of reckoning I'm still learning to sit with, but it feels necessary, even if it's uncomfortable. What I'm coming to accept is that healing isn't a straight line. It's a tangle of steps forward and backward, moments of hope intertwined with shadows of doubt. And within that mess, there's room for compassion, not just for her, but for me, for the man who loved fiercely, who was vulnerable, who stumbled but kept trying. I'm learning to forgive myself for the times I held on too tightly, for the moments I let fear dictate my actions. Because in that forgiveness, I find a quiet strength that doesn't demand perfection, only the courage to keep moving. So tonight, as I sit with these tangled emotions, I'm beginning to let go of the need to have all the answers. I'm learning to sit with the uncertainty, to honor the pain without letting it define me. And in that stillness, something shifts, a soft turning inward, a gentle acceptance that maybe the hardest love is the one you have to give yourself first. The knock on the door was sharp, insistent, too loud to ignore. I wasn't expecting anyone, and the heaviness in my chest told me this wasn't going to be a friendly visit. I paused, heart hammering, before crossing the room. When I opened it, there she stood, her eyes swollen, face pale, but with a coldness I hadn't seen before. Behind her, two men in dark suits lingered quietly, watching. "I need to talk," she said, voice brittle but steady. I stepped aside, letting them in. The apartment felt smaller with the weight of their presence, the air thick and suffocating. She didn't look at me, just spoke quickly, almost rehearsed. "I'm done. I want a clean break. No more calls, no more messages. And the apartment? You have to move out." I blinked, trying to process. "What are you saying? She cut me off with a sharp glance. "I've already talked to a lawyer. They sent you the notice. You have 30 days. The words hit me like a punch. 30 days to erase everything we built together. To pack up a lifetime of memories and dreams. I swallowed hard, searching for some flicker of reason, some leftover trace of the girl I once knew. But all I saw was a stranger wrapped in finality. "Why now?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. She met my eyes then, and it wasn't pain or regret I saw. It was resolve. "Because this isn't working. Maybe it never was." The men handed me a thick envelope stamped with official seals, paperwork, legal jargon. I didn't have the strength to untangle. It wasn't just a breakup anymore. It was a declaration of war on the life we shared. I wanted to argue, to beg, to scream, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I stood there, silent, feeling the walls close in. Her footsteps echoed as she turned away, disappearing into the hallway like a ghost, reclaiming a life without me. The door clicked shut, and suddenly the apartment was emptier than ever. The silence screamed at me, louder than any confrontation. My hands trembled as I clutched the papers, cold, impersonal, irreversible. I sank to the floor, the weight of betrayal and loss crashing down in a tidal wave. The future I thought we might have was ripped away in an instant, replaced by a harsh, undeniable reality. This wasn't just the end of us. It was a complete erasure of what I'd thought was unbreakable. The quiet fury inside me stirred, anger, disbelief, a desperate need to fight back. But the fight wasn't mine to choose anymore. She'd made her decision, and with it, she'd shut the door on any chance of reconciliation. I realized then that the fragile hope I'd clung to was nothing but a lie I told myself to survive. Now, the truth was raw and merciless. Everything had changed, and there was no going back. With the notice in my hands and her absence pressing in like a storm, the last thread holding me to the past snapped, leaving me suspended on the edge of a future I couldn't yet see, but which demanded I face it alone. The days after she served me, the notice slipped by in a haze of numbness and disbelief. I moved through the motions of life like a ghost, the apartment feeling more like a cage than a home. The walls, once witnesses to laughter and whispered dreams, now seemed to close in, pressing down with the weight of finality. But beneath that suffocating fog, something inside me was shifting. A quiet, insistent voice that refused to be drowned out by sorrow or anger. It wasn't an epiphany or a sudden burst of clarity. It was more like a slow burn, a steady gathering of strength that grew with every breath I took in the stillness of that empty space. I realized that I'd been living on the edge of surrender for too long, caught between hope and despair, unable to fully let go or fight back. But now, with the legal papers in my hands and her absence echoing louder than ever, I knew I had to choose. Not for her, not for us, but for myself. So I made a decision. One Thursday evening, when the city lights flickered through the window and the apartment was swallowed by shadows, I sat down at the kitchen table. This table where we'd shared countless meals, plans, and quiet moments. I pulled out the envelope she'd left behind and laid it flat before me. The papers felt heavy, their cold ink a stark reminder of what was lost. But I didn't shrink from them. Instead, I reached for my phone and drafted a message. Not to her, but to the lawyer she'd involved. "I accept the terms," I typed, my fingers steady despite the storm inside. "I will vacate the apartment within 30 days. Please send me the details for the handover." I hesitated for a moment before hitting send, feeling the weight of those words settle like stones in my chest. But as the message left my outbox, a strange calm washed over me. This wasn't just compliance, it was a reclaiming of control. I wasn't running or hiding. I was facing the reality head-on, on my own terms. Later that night, she came back. It was unexpected. No knocks, no messages. Just the soft click of the door opening and her silhouette framed in the dim hallway light. She moved cautiously, as if stepping into a house haunted by what we once had. Our eyes met briefly, and for a heartbeat, I saw the flicker of the girl I used to know. The one who laughed, who trusted, who loved without reservation. But I was no longer the man who waited silently for her return. "Why are you here?" I asked, my voice calm but firm. There was no room left for pleading or confusion. She looked down, biting her lip, and then up again, her eyes glistening. I wanted to talk. To explain." I shook my head gently. "There's nothing left to explain. You made your choice. I'm making mine." The words weren't cruel. They were a boundary. A line drawn not in anger but in self-respect. I could feel the tension thickening the air between us. But I held steady. This was the moment I'd been building toward. The moment where I stopped being a passive witness to my own unraveling. She swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can we at least figure out how to do this without tearing each other apart?" I nodded slowly, the weight of years pressing down, but also lifting. "We can be civil. But this ends here. For both our sakes." She gave a small, sad smile. A fragile truce. Then, without another word, she turned and left, the door closing softly behind her. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of possibilities I hadn't dared to imagine before. I stood there for a moment, feeling the stillness settle deep into my bones. The apartment was no longer a prison, but a space I was preparing to leave behind. And with that, I felt the first true stirrings of freedom, not the kind born from revenge or bitterness, but the quiet, unshakable strength of someone who has chosen themselves. In that moment, I made a promise to myself. No matter how hard the road ahead, I would not lose sight of who I was beneath the heartbreak. I would walk away from this chapter with my dignity intact, my heart bruised but unbroken. Because sometimes, the most powerful love is the one you give yourself first, and I was ready to live that truth, fully and without regret. The first night in my new apartment was quieter than I expected. Not the eerie silence of absence, but a soft, steady calm that settled around me like a familiar blanket. Moving out hadn't been easy. Every box I unpacked carried fragments of our life together, memories tucked between clothes and books. Yet, as I arranged my things on bare shelves and smoothed the surface of the kitchen counter, I felt something shift. A subtle reclaiming of space, both physical and emotional. This place isn't grand or luxurious. It's modest. A one-bedroom with sunlight that spills through dusty blinds and a creaky floorboard near the door. But it's mine. For the first time in a long time, I'm not navigating someone else's expectations or the shadow of shared history. My footsteps echo differently here. Lighter, less burdened. I'm learning the rhythms of a new routine. Coffee brewed just how I like it. Mornings spent with a book instead of waiting for a message. Evenings where I decide the silence isn't empty but full of possibility. There's a strange mixture of relief and exhaustion that colors these days. Relief, because the fight has ended. Not with a bang, but with a quiet clarity that took away the weight of uncertainty. Exhaustion, because letting go isn't a single moment. It's a slow unraveling that leaves you raw and tired. I find myself drifting between numbness and moments of sharp awareness, like walking through a fog that occasionally parts enough to reveal a clearer path ahead. I've started small rituals that anchor me. Mornings include journaling, not to dwell on what was lost, but to chart what I'm finding in myself. I jot down 3 things I'm grateful for, no matter how insignificant they seem. The way sunlight hits the wall, the taste of good coffee, the sound of a neighbor's laughter. These little acknowledgments ground me, reminding me that life continues, that joy can still live in the quiet corners. The nights are different too. Instead of scrolling through my phone, I light a candle and sit by the window, watching the city breathe. Sometimes, I play music that used to remind me of us, but now feels like a soundtrack to my own story. I let the melodies wash over me, not to relive pain, but to feel the texture of healing. Slow, uneven, but undeniably real. Her attempts to reach out have become sporadic and more distant. A message here, a call there, always carefully worded, as if trying to test the waters without disturbing the calm I'm building. I don't respond immediately, sometimes not at all. When I do, it's with measured words that hold firm boundaries. No anger, no pleading, just honesty and respect for the space I've carved out. One evening, she sent a message asking if we could meet to talk things through. I read it twice before typing back, "I'm focusing on moving forward right now. I wish you well." Those words felt like a shield and a bridge at the same time, protecting my progress, yet offering peace without reopening old wounds. Friends have noticed the change too. Mark, especially, has been a steady presence, a reminder that connection doesn't have to come with strings or expectations. We meet for coffee, for hikes, for unhurried conversations that don't revolve around heartbreak, but about life's small victories and future possibilities. Rebuilding these connections feels like planting seeds in soil long left fallow. Work has become a refuge and a place of growth. I throw myself into projects with a new focus, not to escape, but to engage with parts of myself I'd neglected. There's a satisfaction in productivity, in seeing tangible results from effort, in knowing that I'm contributing to something beyond the tangled web of my past relationship. Even the mundane acts, washing dishes, folding laundry, tidying the apartment, take on new meaning. They're gestures of care, not just for the space, but for myself. Every item put in place, every corner swept clean is a quiet assertion. I'm here. I matter. I'm rebuilding on my own terms. At times, I catch myself thinking about what it means to truly forgive, not to forget or excuse, but to release the grip of bitterness so I can move freely. It's a slow, imperfect process, but with each passing day, the edges of pain soften just enough to let in something softer. Hope, acceptance, a tentative trust in myself. I'm learning that strength isn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes, it's the quiet decision to show up for yourself again and again, to honor your own needs without guilt, to set boundaries not as walls, but as foundations. It's in choosing peace over chaos, dignity over despair. This chapter isn't about triumph or revenge. It's about standing steady in the aftermath, bruised but unbroken, cautious but open. I'm no longer defined by what was taken or lost, but by what I'm choosing to build. A life shaped by self-respect, clarity, and a gentle courage that whispers, I am enough. And as I sit here, the city lights flickering through my window, I know the path ahead is uncertain. But for the first time in a long time, I'm walking it with a sense of purpose and quiet confidence. I'm not looking back. I'm building something new, something real, from the ground up. It's strange how time doesn't erase everything, but it reshapes the way we hold what once seemed unbearable. Looking back now, I don't carry the weight of bitterness or anger the way I did before. Instead, I feel a quiet kind of understanding. A recognition that some chapters are meant to close not with fireworks, but with a steady, unspoken nod to the lessons etched deep into your skin. What I've learned is that love, no matter how fierce or true, sometimes isn't enough to bridge the spaces people need to grow apart. That realization was the hardest to swallow. Not because it diminished what we had, but because it forced me to confront the parts of myself I hadn't known were fragile. I didn't lose just a relationship. I lost an image of who I thought I was, and that loss came with its own kind of grief. But from that grief, a quieter strength began to emerge. One not born of defiance or denial, but from acceptance. I've accepted that some journeys are solitary. Her quest to find herself was never a rejection of me, but a reflection of her own internal struggle. Something I couldn't fix or follow, no matter how much I wanted to. And in accepting that, I found a space to reclaim my own identity beyond the us that had defined so much of my life. It wasn't about erasing the past, but about making peace with it, allowing memories to exist without letting them dictate my present. There's a calm that comes from releasing the need to control outcomes or rewrite stories. I've let go of the what-ifs and the if-onlys that once haunted me, recognizing they're just echoes of a mind trying to hold on too tightly. Instead, I focus on the present moments that are mine to shape. The mornings with quiet coffee, the conversations with friends who remind me of who I am, and the small, ordinary acts of self-care that stitch me back together day by day. I no longer see the past as a wound that needs scabbing over, but as a collection of experiences that have, in their own way, taught me resilience and compassion, not just for others, but for myself. I've learned to meet my own pain with gentle patience, to hold space for my imperfections without judgment. That kindness toward myself feels like the truest form of healing I've found. If there's one truth I want to share, whether for myself or for anyone watching who has felt the sting of love lost, it's this. Your worth isn't defined by someone else's inability to stay, to understand, or to love you the way you deserve. Sometimes, the bravest act is to step away from what breaks you, not to abandon love, but to protect the love you have left for yourself. And in that protection, there is a grace that can carry you through even the darkest nights. A small moment that stays with me is simple. A late afternoon when I sat by the window, watching sunlight scatter over the city rooftops. There was no grand revelation, no flood of emotion, just a soft awareness that I was here, alive and moving forward. That quiet peace, free from expectation or regret, felt like a gift. It was a reminder that even after loss, life holds space for new beginnings. Not always bright or bold, but honest and real. This is where I am now, not healed in a perfect way, but grounded in a truth that doesn't need fixing. The story of us is finished, but my own story continues, written with an open heart and steady hands. And that I've come to see is enough. Thank you for listening and sharing this space with me. If this story resonated with you, or if you know someone who might need to hear that it's okay to choose themselves, please consider subscribing, liking, or passing it along. Sometimes, the smallest act of connection can be the beginning of healing. For now, I'll leave you with this thought. Sometimes, the quietest endings hold the most profound beginnings.